Number 50. Today we are tackling two historical topics. It's 6.4 and 6.5, the New South, and then the technological innovations of the late 19th century. So because it's two historical topics, we have two themes. The first one is American and national identity, and the second one is work, exchange, and technology. So for the first topic, we have the learning objective 6.C, explain how various factors contributed to continuity and change in the New South from 1877 to 1898. So, this New South, despite the industrialization of subsegments of the Southern economy, a change promoted by Southern leaders who called for a New South, it was an agriculture based on sharecropping, and tenant farming continued to be the primary economic activity in the South. So, this New South vision was proposed by Henry Grady. He was a journalist, and it was calling for a capitalist, industrialized society in the South. And he was trying to make the Southern economy be more like the Northern economy. However, there were still elements of white supremacy in Henry Grady's vision. He had made several speeches in which he wanted to keep African Americans as second-class citizens and whites on top. So there you see some continuities from the Old South during Reconstruction and the antebellum to the late 19th century, with those racial views pervading. Now, there is some success in some cities in industrialization. Richmond becomes a center for the tobacco industry, Memphis for the lumber industry, but a lot of these developments are being financed by northern banks. And so all of the profits that are being made in some of these industries are leaving the region, and they're not being used to reinvest into other parts of the economy. There is no expansion in education, so the southern population continues to stagnate. There's still a dependency on cotton. There's still sharecropping and tenant farming, which are keeping people in a form of slavery or servitude, being tied to the land. And you can see that on the map on the bottom left, it is a map of wealth in the late 19th century. And most of the wealth is being concentrated in the north and in the northeast. The only areas in the south where there are larger amounts of wealth are along the Mississippi River Valley, in the port cities, in Alabama and in Louisiana. But really, that's it. It's still largely agricultural, despite this push to industrialize the South. All right, so more continuities here in regards to race. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson that upheld racial segregation helped to mark the end of most of the political gains African Americans had made during Reconstruction. So the case follows Omer Plessy, who is seen on the top left, and the Committee of Citizens to challenge the laws that were segregating railway cars in New Orleans. Plessy was 1/8 black, and it was difficult to tell that he was black. So he deliberately sits in the white car to challenge this segregation law. He alerts people even before he sits in the car that he's going to do this, just so that he can get arrested and challenge the law, sending it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court holds that separate accommodations do not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. All of the justices were in accordance to this holding, except for just one. It is Justice John Marshall Harlan. And in his dissent, he was calling out the law specifically, saying that there was only intent to segregate blacks and whites in this cart law. He says everyone knows that the statute in question had its origin in the purpose, not so much to exclude white people from railroad cars occupied by blacks, as to exclude colored people from coaches occupied by or assigned to white persons. The thing to accomplish was, under the guise of giving equal accommodation for whites and blacks, to compel the latter to keep to themselves while traveling in railroad passenger coaches. No one would be so wanting in candor as to assert the contrary. So despite Harlan's dissent, this new legal doctrine of separate but equal is created, and any new segregation law that is being challenged is going to be put up to the separate but equal standard. And in the end, this separate but equal doctrine will be used through 1954. It's not until Brown versus the Board of Education that separate but equal is struck down. In that court ruling, the court found that inherently separate accommodations are unequal, or separate accommodations are inherently unequal. All right, so facing increased violence, discrimination, and scientific theories of race, African American reformers continue to fight for political and social equality. So we already saw that civil rights gains are being taken down. The civil rights cases in 1883 had weakened the 14th and 15th Amendments, and Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 did that even further. Now, the reformers and the advocates for African Americans that are active during this time period, we have Frederick Douglass, who has been active through the majority of the 19th century, from before the Civil War into the 1890s. He makes one memorable speech in the 1890s at the World's Fair Exposition in Chicago, and it was in relation to a pamphlet that he and Ida B. Wells had published called The Negro Problem. He says, "Men talk of the Negro problem. There is no Negro problem. The problem is whether American people have loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough to live up to their own Constitution. We Negroes love our country. We fought for it. We ask only that we be treated as well as those who fought against it," calling out the former Confederates that are still in the South. So Ida B. Wells becomes an advocate for African Americans after her study on lynching. She aggregates all these statistics of lynchings throughout the South to prove that it is not isolated problems in separate areas, that they are targeting attacks against African Americans who are becoming more economically prosperous. Next, we have W.E.B. Du Bois. He was a graduate of Harvard, and he calls for action on equality, and he wants more drastic action and fast drastic action. He is the leader of the Niagara Movement, which will create the NAACP, and they will be active through the 20th century, challenging discriminatory laws. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois' foil is counterpart would be Booker T. Washington. He was also active at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, but he wants to take a more pragmatic approach. In his Atlanta Compromise speech, he wants African Americans to take the jobs that are available to them and achieve economic equality first before they start asking for social equality. So he was trying to have a more compromising position for African Americans to put up with the social inequality, with the laws like the separate but equal laws, and then eventually, once they become economically equals to white, that they could ask for that social equality. The problem was that without the social equality, it was really difficult for African Americans to become economically equal to whites. All right, our next learning objective: explain the effects of technological advances in the development of the United States over time. So, businesses made use of technological innovations and greater access to natural resources to dramatically increase the production of goods. So here's a list of technological innovations that we see during this time period. The telephone, which was discovered or invented by Alexander Graham Bell. Adding machines, these are calculators. The Bessemer process, which made steel faster, cheaper, and stronger. We had consumer cameras by the Eastman Camera Company. You see an example of what one looked like early in the 20th century there. They used to be called brownies because they were in brown boxes that had been lined with leather. The electric light, the elevator, all of these are making communication faster, and some of these are consumer products that people are able to buy, so it's driving the economy. We have two very important inventors during this time, George Westinghouse and Thomas Edison, and they get into what is called the current wars. Which type of electric current the United States is going to adopt. So George Westinghouse is advocating for alternating current, and Thomas Edison is advocating for direct current. Eventually, the United States chooses alternating current for some of the safety features and convenience features of it. One thing on the bottom right here, you see an image of an elephant. This is actually part of a moving picture that the Thomas Edison Company was able to produce. The elephant is sadly being electrocuted. So this was a large event that was drawing people, and the Thomas Edison Company wanted to film some footage of it. There was also increased production, so we have rise of department stores, the Macy's department store, Woolworths, and other mail-in catalogs like the Sears Roebuck catalog. They were the size of books. They had so many products inside of them, and people could order a product, send in a money order or send in a check, and then they would receive their products much later on. This was the 19th century version of Amazon Prime. And it's leading to a rise of consumer economies all across the United States now that markets are being connected through railroads. And that's it. So here's our recap. There are attempts at industrialization in the South. They have limited success. Segregation became constitutional through the case Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And a new wave of African American reformers advocate for equality. And finally, new technologies dramatically increase production and sales of goods. All right, thank you for watching. Come back to watch lecture number 51.